Hello, welcome everybody. Either good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this global webinar on the Biofin Financial Needs Assessment. My name is Onno van der Heuvel. I'm the Global Manager for Biofin based in Istanbul. For those of you who are not familiar with our series, this is part of a bigger series that follows the Biofin methodology. We had 2 editions before. One covering the policy institutional review, another one covering the biodiversity expense review, and those are available on the web, the recorded versions, if you're interested to go back to those. And we're going to have another one on the biodiversity finance plan in the future. And special welcome to those participants joining for the first time. Now, how's this webinar structured? We're going to have 3 parts. First, we do an introduction of what are the CBD Biofin regional nodes, which is going to be generally covered by my colleague Hervé Barrois, who's one of our team members on this. And this will be also complemented by introduction of the CBD perspective and explanation how this all links to the financial reporting framework. That should take around 10 minutes. After that, we're going to go to the main presentation done by David Myers, our senior advisor, who was the person leading the exercise to develop the Biofin workbook. And he's going to present for 40 minutes on the main concepts of the financial needs assessment. And after that, we have the opportunity for some questions, around 30 minutes, as well as some discussions. So with that, I think we're going to get going. And let's start with Hervé. Over to you, Hervé.
Thank you, Onno. Hello, I am Hervé Barrois from Biofin team. I'm going to introduce very briefly to you the CBD Biofin Regional Nodes initiatives. First of all, I would like to remind new people what is Biofin. Biofin, it's an approach, it's a national approach who try to aim to assess existing resources and resource needed to implement national biodiversity strategy and target at national level. And it provides guidance to estimate financial gap and national resources, as you can see on the left of your screen. And the aim of Biofin through the implementation activities is to reduce the financial gap and to implement a national biodiversity target. And 2 main strategies is proposed is to reduce the needs, as you see on top of your screen, and increase resources. I'm not going to go in detail at this stage, but it's just a brief introduction to Biofin approach. What is Biofin? It's as well Biofin, it's a national process to engage different stakeholders around biodiversity financing concepts. It include different steps, a policy institutional review, followed by a biodiversity expenditure review, a financial need assessment, and all together they culminate by the production of biodiversity finance plan. Today we will dive in more detail in the financial need assessments. All the different steps of methodology provide data that can be used for the CBD financial reporting framework. The Biofin CBD regional node was officially launched in 2016 at the COP13 in Mexico. There is 1 dedicated person per region. As you can see, 3 regions around the world. I'm myself in charge of the Africa, Central Asia, Eastern Africa, Eastern Europe region. There's 2 other persons dedicated for Central and South America and Asia and South Pacific. The objective of the CBD Biofin regional nodes is to provide countries with knowledge and targeted technical support about the Biofin methodology. Different types of support One is targeted technical support to develop in-country knowledge. Two is to provide access to countries which express interest to participate in Biofin webinar. Three is to promote regional knowledge sharing. Four is to access and develop knowledge product. Five is to develop an inventory of existing finance solutions in the country and identify the best opportunities. Six is to access global network of biodiversity finance experts. Which countries are eligible to receive support? All developing countries and countries with an economy in development can apply to these initiatives, except the one obviously that are not involved already with Biofin. How to participate? CBD national need to submit an expression of interest to Biofin, to the email indicated on the slide, biofin@undp.org, with a copy to the CBD Secretariat. If required more information, you can contact with the email here, hervébarois@undp.org, or you can contact my colleague in Latin America and Caribbean island at undp.org. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Ono.
Thank you very much for that, Hervé. And if you're representing a country that is already following our webinar series but hasn't yet sent any expression of interest, we strongly encourage you to do so. This gives us a very good overview of the countries that are actually interested to apply the Biofin methodology. So please look back at that information if you are not able to note it. We're going to send it out after the webinar to everybody. Let's move over now to the CBD, and I'm passing over to Marcus Lehmann to tell us a bit more about the CBD perspective and how this whole process is beneficial for the financial reporting framework.
Yes, thank you very much, Ono. I just realized that I pulled the wrong presentation up, so if you give me, if you could perhaps take my screen away while I take the right one. Sorry about that. I just realized that that's an earlier one here. But it shall come in
a minute. That's no problem. We'll we can handle that.
Okay, so I have already the right one here. Okay, sorry about that. I'm Markus Lehmann with the Convention Secretariat, and I'm going to talk about a bit how these webinars, the webinar series, and of course the Biofin methodology and what it wants to achieve in countries or wants to help you in achieving it in your countries, how that relates to the targets for resource mobilization under the convention and the associated financial reporting. So just to recall, we have these targets for resource mobilization adopted at COP 12. There were preliminary targets at COP 11, and then they were finalized and adopted by COP 12. You see them on the screen here. There is a dedicated target to international flows, this famous doubling target, doubling international biodiversity-related funding flows to developing countries by 2015. But then there are a number of other targets which in fact relate very closely to the individual steps of the Biofin methodology, which is not surprising given that they basically have the same root in earlier discussions under the convention. So there is a target on the inclusion of biodiversity national priorities and development plans, and the webinar we had earlier on the institutional review talked about how to achieve that and basically identify and gather the relevant information. We have a target on reporting domestic biodiversity expenditures by 2015 also, which is already passed, but now, and the expenditure review webinar talked about this. Now we are talking about funding needs assessment, and that's that's related obviously to the second element of that particular target here, the third bullets, the funding needs, gaps, and priorities. Now, just to recall, for these targets for resource mobilization, we have a financial reporting framework, which is accessible under the link here, which basically provides a structured online questionnaire onto these specific targets for resource mobilization. So the default is that the national focal points or resource mobilization focal points can log in under this link with their usual credentials. These credentials can be, or these access rights can be delegated to persons working with the focal point simply by writing an email to the email address you're seeing here. And if you have any technical questions, you can also write to that email address. So let's now have a look at the relevant section of the financial reporting framework, the one that is relevant to the funding needs assessment. Of course, the Biofin methodology foresees a very thorough, comprehensive assessment of the financial needs, typically for implementing the revised NBSAP. All we want to have here, because this is high level, if you may, strategic reporting against the targets for resource mobilization, all we want to have here is that is an globally, okay, no, not globally, but nationally aggregated funding need per year. So, and for that, you would basically, you can create rows here, depending on the time horizon of your revised NBSAPs. You assign a certain year, you provide the funding needs. Automatically, when you do that, you will get a next row for the next year, and then you simply stop when basically you reach the horizon of your planning. So the year is not predetermined. You pick the year which is suited to your own planning and your planning of the revised NBSAPs. Of course, you pick your currency. Importantly here, you see this field here. You need to identify whether that's in units, in thousands, in millions, depending on your currencies. On your national currency, you might then avoid entering a lot of zeros. Now, in terms of the funding gap, the funding gap here, you see this field is gray. That means it is automatically calculated by subtracting the estimated available resources from the funding need per year. Now, in order to estimate the available resources, we offer, but it's really up to you to use it, to use a little estimation tool here, simply by extrapolating the average of the biodiversity-related expenditures you reported in the earlier section, the section that responds to the biodiversity-related expenditures. So what you can do, if you choose yes, you basically pick an annual percentage increase over this average, which I took 3% here, and then for the next year, it will automatically increase the estimated available resources. So the average in that case was 5 million, so it increases here to 5,150,000. And then if you enter here the funding need, as I said, the funding gap is calculated automatically. Now, this is of course a bit crude in terms of an estimation tool. If you have a finer, say what you think is a finer estimation, you can of course use this one and then enter basically your estimated available resources on your own. This is then how it would look in the end, assuming that you have a planning horizon over 4 years. So assuming that the NBSAP, the revised NBSAP, entered into force beginning of 2016. Now, the actions for priority funding, This is basically, you can also take that from your revised NBSAP. Mind you that you can enter several actions here simply by separating them with a semicolon. I put a few examples here, but then of course that would come from your NBSAP, as I said. Additional methodological observation comments. I put in here what could typically be said in this field. So you refer to your revised NBSAP, of course. You might, if you are a Biofin country or if you are supported through the regional nodes, you could refer to the outcome of the Biofin needs assessment, which might even be available somewhere online. That's, of course, just an example how it could look like. So this is a brief snapshot on how to basically complete the financial reporting framework. I have to say that we are going to come up with a version for the new round, which will basically use the data that you have identified here for further progress reporting. With that, thank you very much, and I look forward to the presentation on the needs assessment methodology itself.
Thank you very much, Marcus. That really clarifies one of the benefits of the finance needs assessments, one of the areas what you can use the data for. Just a very practical comment. You may already have any questions, but we're going to park all of those. There are two ways to raise questions. Either you can press the hand icon, or you can write your question in the question box. We're going to address all of the questions that are coming in only at the end, so that we don't interrupt the presentation. So with that, let's move now to our main presentation on the financial needs assessment. David, over to you.
Thank you, Onno, and thank you, Hervé and Marcus, for giving those introductory presentations. I just want to start with a comment that this presentation follows quite closely the chapter 6 in the Biofin 2016 workbook, which you can download if you haven't already from the Biofin website. That's biodiversityfinance.net, and highly recommend that that you look through the detailed guidance provided in that methodology to support this presentation. So we'll start with just as has been mentioned before, Biofin works currently in 30 countries, with another one, Namibia, being part of our family, implementing the Biofin methodology. The financial needs assessment is part of the overall Biofin process, which is a process that occurs at the national level. As Hervé mentioned, there are these sort of 4 products that come from the process. The policy institutional review, the biodiversity expenditure review, and the financial needs assessment, and then ultimately they all contribute to a national biodiversity finance plan. And so we've already given presentations on the policy institutional review as well as the expenditure review. This is the financial needs assessment, and as you can see, there's a linkage between the biodiversity expenditure review and the financial needs assessment that we'll talk about later on in the presentation. So what are the aims of the financial needs assessment? And I may abbreviate that as the FNA, because I'm used to calling it by its abbreviated name. It's to provide a comprehensive estimate of the financial resources needed to achieve national and subnational biodiversity targets. The ideal is to compare financial needs to available biodiversity expenditures. A big part of it is making sure that the biodiversity targets at national level are articulated clearly in the NBSAPs and other key national strategies. We want the assessment to be well documented and argued, prioritized, and fully costed. And ultimately, the FNA can provide, can guide implementation on implementing different finance solutions that will be described in the biodiversity finance plan. Some core principles to start with. that the FNA should be comprehensive. It should cover all aspects of sustainable biodiversity management in the country. It should be accurate. The cost should be justifiable and the actions directed at achieving the specific results. It should be detailed. This is not just a very rapid estimate, but a real detailed estimate, and there's a structure and a hierarchy to looking at strategies, targets, and results. And it should be prioritized. That it's important to think about what are the priority actions, and ultimately we'll think about what the costs are associated with those, and it's important to think about priorities. And it should be aligned with the national budgeting process and the fiscal policy approach of the country. And that's for maximum implementation. So we're going to talk a little bit about approaches right now, and then we'll go into the actual steps. So ideally, budgeting is going to connect financial inputs with desired outputs. And there are different approaches to budgeting, and the choice of the approach is very important. Each approach has its inherent strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to go over a few different approaches. And in many cases, to achieve a detailed, accurate budgeting, you're going to have to combine several different approaches. So this table lists on the left column some different costing approaches. Incremental budgeting approach is, in a way, a classical approach where the Ministry of Finance will say, okay, Ministry of Environment, you have 3% more budget this year than you had last year. Give us your budget estimate. And so the ministry then goes through and figures it, how can we add 3% to our previous budget? It's a gradual change. There's good continuity. That's a good benefit, but the challenge is it's not really asking to think through a vision. Often they're not connected with results. Historical projections build on empirical data, on past expenditure. They can be accurate, but they are generally, the data are not comprehensive, and it makes it difficult to budget new things. Cost modeling is the third approach, and here you're extrapolating from small but detailed cases or models, sort of economic or financial models that you have. It's really useful for different scenarios, looking at cost effectiveness, comparing different options. It may be limited by lack of empirical data. I just want to make a note that if someone else has a microphone on, if they could switch that off, that would be fantastic. Activity-based costing is another approach that provides project budgeting. This is kind of like program-based budgeting. Often, this is very common. It's good bottom-up budgeting, but it's not necessarily focused on outcomes or results. It's focused on activities. So we're going to, say, write a plan for this. That sounds great. You can produce a plan. It's an action. But what is the result of that? Where it gets to results-based costing, which is the approach that a lot of countries are moving towards. This is something that Biofin is promoting. It's planning by objectives, log frame. It's also called program-based budgeting. A lot of countries, as I mentioned, are trying to implement this or are implementing this across the entire government. It's considered a best practice as it focuses on the results and what it takes to achieve those results. But it's very challenging to get this implemented throughout a country level. And we'll be talking more about that. And as you can see, there's been an evolution towards results-based costing, where, for the most part, as you increase in effectiveness and efficiency on the left scale, as you go up that curve, you're actually adding complexity. And so ultimately, the integration of costing, budgeting, and organizational and individual performance assessment is where we want to get to, but it takes time, and Indonesia, for example, I think they've mentioned they've been implementing results-based budgeting for 11 years, and they're still improving it and still working on it. So, but it is definitely the future of detailed budgeting and costing. So just a bit more about results-based costing or results-based budgeting. The costs are associated with specific, often longer-term results, and really not focused on immediate activities. The outcome of the activity or the result is the budgeting focus. It's a logical framework. We're looking for long-term impacts described as outcomes. So what are the outputs needed to achieve those outcomes? What are the actions needed to achieve those outputs? And that's how you get to programmation. Also called performance-based budgeting, because sometimes sometimes ministries or companies, for example, will reward organizations or individuals for their performance. And Peru, as an example, launched a national budget system reform strategy that included results-based budgeting. The aim was to ensure that the government provided the people with the planned quality of goods and services that they had promised. So they had clear and objective definitions of the results, a commitment by the government entities to achieve those results, and then an establishment of a mechanism for generating information on the products that produced, the results, and management efforts. So the elements of that run by the Ministry of Economy and Finance were budget programs, performance monitoring, independent third-party evaluations, and then management incentives. So altogether it created an incentive package to get everyone on board, and greatly improved the transparency of government activities, and quite a successful approach. Here's an example of some cost modeling. This comes from Thailand, and looking at coral reef restoration costs. And you can see here on the far right, there's a sort of per hectare cost of different approaches. So transplanting on concrete, providing an artificial reef or a floating nursery, they all have different sort of per hectare costs, and they also have different likelihoods of success. Here's an example, again from Thailand, on coastal erosion prevention. So there's quite a range of alternative approaches. There are unit costs per meter, so one would think, well, let's go then to the cheapest, because that's going to be the best, a bamboo wall. It's only cost 3,000 or 4,000 baht per meter, but in fact, if you look at the durability and effectiveness, it's quite low. So you may want to combine a few different measures, cost and effectiveness. And so this is just, again, one way to use a kind of modeling to help in your financial needs assessment. Okay, here we are now on the main steps of the FNA, and we'll go through each of these steps in greater detail. Preparation, step 2, scoping and clarifying the NBSAP actions, or whichever actions we are going to be costing. Desktop study and initial costing tables, refining the costing models with expert input, analyzing the results, and estimating the finance needs. So step 6.1 is preparation. Here we build on all the work that's been done up to now with the policy and institutional review, the expenditure review, form a working group. Often the working group's already formed, so you're just making sure that you have the right people on board. Looking at develop a timeline and a work plan, especially with stakeholder consultations. Review the methodology in the Biofin workbook and the data tool, as well as looking at what other countries have done, and then identify your potential sources of data by reaching out to stakeholders. It's important to bring stakeholders along with this. If you come up with a budget, really detailed budget of the NBSAP, and no one believes you, then that's not a very effective approach. If you brought all the NBSAP stakeholders together with you, and they understand where the numbers are coming from, you have a much greater chance of getting buy-in, and that buy-in is essential for implementation. Step 2, scoping and clarifying the NBSAP results, strategies, and actions. Now we focus on the NBSAPs, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, because they are the main document that in most countries that describes what the country is planning on doing to achieve the Aichi targets, and unifies the sort of biodiversity focused activities. But in many countries, the NBSAPs are can be rather vague in terms of their action part, and in also other countries, NBSAPs are used as basically fundraising documents where they describe projects that should be funded that are additional to ongoing activities. And as you'll see later on, a lot of the expenditure review focuses on ongoing activities, and so oftentimes it makes it hard comparing it. So, so we're going to review that NBSAP, and we're going to use a logical framework in 6.2b to structure and clarify actions and results, and then some pre-costing prioritization. Those are the steps in 6.2. So we want to look for comprehensiveness and quality of the NBSAP, and ask ourselves, should other strategic documents be included in this analysis and the costing? For example, if an NBSAP is very narrowly focused and the, say, biggest threat to biodiversity in the country is agricultural expansion into forests, just making up, for example, you may want to include elements, if there is a strategic sustainable agricultural plan or the green economy plan, you may want to include elements of that, especially if it hasn't been adequately costed or budgeted, if they are priorities for biodiversity management in the country. We want to look at the greatest biodiversity impact potential. So what scope is the best for challenges that we're facing in the country? You also want to look at what the stated interest is of key decision makers. What matters to those decision makers? In island countries, for example, like the Philippines, protection against increasing storm damage, for example, due to climate change is a really important issue. And so is there a way, is there a strategy, is there a way to bring that in? Then you want to think about the NBSAP or whatever strategies you've chosen as parts of a logical framework, a logical approach, where you have a long-term objective, you have expected outcomes that lead to that objective, and then you have specific outputs that will result in those outcomes. Outcomes tend to be longer term. Outputs tend to be shorter term. And then what inputs and resources are required to produce those outputs that result in those expected outcomes to help support your achievement of the objectives. I think everyone's seen these kind of structures before. Now the NBSAP tends to have the national biodiversity targets, strategies, and in many cases sub-strategies, actions that support those sub-strategies, and what we term costable actions, where the idea here is that oftentimes the actions are descriptive but not quantified, and so it's, as you go through and try to produce a budget for them, you'll find that it's very difficult to produce a budget when you don't know how many inland wetlands are going to be rehabilitated, for example. You know, if the goal is to rehabilitate, the action is rehabilitate inland wetlands. How many? Where? Things like that. So we basically encourage the conversion of actions into what we call costable actions, and these are the relationship of sort of what I mentioned before, the results, targets. These are basically outcomes, and then these are outputs. So here's an example of where a relatively vague action was converted into a very specific result. I believe this is from Ecuador, and the result here then became biodiversity costs are incorporated into national accounting systems and national and decentralized development plans in order to support poverty reduction and improvement of the new national productivity scheme. Okay, so that's a result. This is the strategy. Is a bit is related introduction of biodiversity value into the policy formulation process. And then here were the costable actions and the key performance indicators. So they suggested a dedicated unit to address economic valuation and sustainable finance that will be established at the Ministry of Environment. 3 specific valuation projects and other standalones. And so from there, you see the very specific three projects. They've identify the actors, and so from there it's possible to identify the cost details. And I mentioned these key performance indicators, that you really want to come up with indicators that are smart, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. You want to specify the target group, for whom, quantity, how much, quality, time, location. By doing so, you really help clarify what it is you're trying to cost. And then there's key performance indicators. These are high-level indicators that are often related to results that you want to evaluate the performance of the NBSAP or performance of the plan that you're working on. So you can have different kinds of indicators. You can have biodiversity indicators that are linked to biological, ecological results. This is what's generally included in the NBSAP, but you can also have financial performance indicators, which can include measures of cost effectiveness. And also there are socioeconomic impacts indicators that you could use as well to look at social outcomes. Here's a couple examples of this biodiversity-related KPI. 10 protected areas that currently have between 70 and 100 poaching incidents will reduce incidents to 50 or less per year as proposed in the NBSAP. This just gives you an idea of how specific you can get. The more specific, the better off. Okay, the last element of this step 6.2 is doing a sort of pre-costing prioritization. We found this to be quite effective because in many cases NBSAPs have a large number of activities, and in some cases you don't have time to do a great detailed costing of each one, so you want to really focus on those that are priority. And then once you have your costing, this helps look at cost benefit in a way, or help prioritize your budgeting spending. So this is often conducted during the process of refining the actions to clarify the results, as I mentioned before. You want to identify these strategies or specific activities that are most likely to achieve clear and important outcomes that are important for achieving the biodiversity goals and vision of the country. And this is preliminary, based on biodiversity importance, not cost. And the result of this process will be a list of or it can even be a ranked list of prioritized actions, strategies, and targets. How you go about doing this is going to vary across countries, but it's important to do that before you start costing. The step 3 is desktop study and initial costing tables. Here you're going to identify the unit costs, review existing detailed budgets and exercises, research unit costs for common budget items. If there's modeling involved, you'll be looking at the models and other information, historical data. The specific substeps are identifying the budget unit standard cost and then building initial costing tables. So substep 1, A rather, is identifying the budget units and standard cost. Each government has a standard set of budget units or account codes, and you definitely want to start there. No sense in reinventing the wheel here. There may also be standard costs that the government has, or standard costs that you develop, and it's best to organize them within these units. They're presented as a hierarchy of categories and detailed subcategories. Like the first one could be, general management, and then it could have all different kinds of subcategories. It's easy to find these. A financial proposal using standard costing units is going to be much more likely to be integrated into the national budgeting process. If you're coming up with a budget that has no relation to the units the government uses, it's going to be very difficult to get that incorporated in. You'll basically have to redo it. Here's an example, from South Africa. These are the summary categories. These are some of the subcategories. Looks like advertising, audit fees, bank charges, communication. This is all in administration and different kinds of equipment. You could come up with as long as you're at least using the summary categories, that's great. But if you can use subcategories and detailed categories, that would really be useful. And then for each of these accounting units, what are the standard costs? For that, you can look at what the previous budgets and budgeting process produced. For example, in India, they have quite a detailed, extensive budgeting process with enormous numbers of data and guidance on how to cost different goals and give different results and different activities. So see what's going on in the country. Don't reinvent the wheel again. However, you know, if you're using standard government costs, just be careful that they're realistic, and do a reality check with them. And if they're off, if they're wrong, if they're historic, if they haven't changed, you know, this is an opportunity to identify that and point that out. Historical costs should be available for a range of different actions, but again, not all of them. And cost modeling is again, basing on these units. This is a way to build up information. You want to divide the costs into recurring or operating costs and capital expenditures. Recurring costs are those costs that generally occur each year, could be each month. Capital expenditures will often have a fixed time pattern, maybe initial capital up front, and then periodically additional capital investments, replacing cars, repairing roads, things like that. All costs should be linked to specific organizations or actors. And administrative costs, we often get this question, how do we deal with that? If you can attribute administrative costs to specific actions, that's great. It could also be estimated as a percentage of total action costs, or done however you like it. But don't forget to include administrative overhead. This is a screenshot of the Biofin data tool. We have an Excel tool that's available to help organize your budgeting and to help build the budget. That's available upon request. We have, so now we're moving to step 6.4, refining costs with expert input. You know, once you've built out, you've come up with these standard costs, you've looked at historical information, you've built basic tables, unit costs, things like that. You want to build some initial costing structures, costing tables, and then present them to experts, either through a series of interviews or sending them to them to get comments, but also through stakeholder engagements. You could do workshops as well. So you're looking at experts and other stakeholders to validate and in many cases elaborate the quantitative details of the costable actions. We're also going to talk about how to do a tagging exercise to link these expenditures to other elements of the Biofin and CBD process, and then you'll refine your models to get the final result. So in terms of tagging, so every expenditure will be associated with the national biodiversity target, whether it's in a theme, a strategy, or a specific action. So as long as you make sure that those national targets or national strategies are included and each action associated with it, you can then summarize based on the different targets, looking at which targets are more expensive, which ones are less expensive. Implementing organizations, again, if you're tying each expenditure, and if there's more than one, for example, implementing organization for a specific action, try to divide up the costs by those organizations so that you ultimately can basically come up with organization-based budgets for implementing the NBSAP. We also highly recommend tagging by sector, again, so you can look at what's being spent by those sectors on biodiversity compared to, say, how dependent those sectors are on biodiversity and that kind of thing. And then we also have 9 Biofin categories that we're encouraging you to also tag with, that will facilitate between country comparisons. Now, where possible, include the ACHI targets. SIA is the System for Environmental Economic Accounting. That's an international standard. And then SDGs. It can also be tags that you use. This is increasingly being used. Step 6.5 is analyzing the costing results. And here you're going to prepare a multi-year direct cost statement. subdivided, as I mentioned before, by strategy, target, sector, actor. You can break it up in different ways. The Biofin data tool allows you to do that. Now you also want to compare the cost to different biodiversity priorities. What's the overall size of that expenditure relative to the results that you're going to achieve, relative to the country's priorities? And you can also look at cost effectiveness. Well, how much is it going to cost to achieve the specific result? Once you have your results quantified and specific, it's easier to do that. If you just have a general action like expand the protected area network. That's really a great thing to do, but if you don't know how many hectares and where, you come up with a price that says it's going to cost $10 million to expand the protected area network, and you don't know what that really means. And also, you know, think about the different distribution of inputs over time and over organization that's going to be necessary. Is the capacity there in the government? This also inputs into the financial solutions. So some of the questions that this analysis will hopefully answer is what are the most prominent costs by different unit codes and types and institutions. Look at the balance between recurrent and investment costs. What are the main cost drivers? Is it there are ways to look at marginal costs. So what is the additional value gained by a specific cost? And how are the financial needs related to the specific results? And what are the main risks based on the assumptions that you've used in the analysis and the costing? Now we can do a second level of prioritization where we've looked at sort of the priority of the actions before, which is on the bottom part of the axis, priority of biodiversity results based on national priorities, based on national vision, and then the cost of the results. Now we have the cost, so you can see if something's a low cost but low priority, it rises medium. Whereas if it's a low cost and a high priority, those are activities that you want to implement rapidly, try to find, search to find funding for, because the return on investment for those activities is predicted here to be high. Those that are high cost but low priority, you may want to move to the back burner and not spend the time doing that, not exclude them, but just make them occur later in the time horizon of the plan. Another approach here is that where you can prioritize is some results may have multiple ways of achieving them. So multiple actions. This is why we really want to focus on results rather than the activities. And this is an example here. Just a creative example looking at trying to decrease poaching incidents of white rhino by 30%. So that's a very specific target. And it turns out that there's a range of actions to achieve that result. The public education, increasing the patrolling staff and patrolling equipment, increased fines. And the fourth one is legal reform to include illegal hunting as a criminal offense, throwing people in jail. So this analysis sort of looked at what's the rapid impact, what's the long-term impact, what's the cost, and then looked at what's the most cost-effective in the short term, and then could you combine these things? So this had a high impact, increasing patrolling staff. It's rapid impact, and it's medium impact in the long term. Cost was medium. So really it was identified that this would probably be the most effective short-term option. So if you really only have a budget for one thing, this is probably what you want to spend it on. Whereas it was agreed that when you look through that all these things combined would have the most impact. So again, this is just a way of comparing in a very light way cost effectiveness of different alternative approaches to achieve the same result. An example in the Philippines, which was really fascinating, is that they went from initial estimations towards secondary and then the final costing through a series of actions and workshops. I'm just going to highlight a few points here. They did a lot of pre-work prior to the initial costing workshop, where they actually had some estimates. They tried to cost the different things. They identified which activities were problematic in terms of lack of clarity. When they then conducted this costing workshop with participation from a wide range of stakeholders, they were able to reform the costing templates, get more detail, one-time versus recurring cost, identify the dates. They presented it then to staff of the government and applied more realistic budgetary calculations. The final costing resulted in incorporating those recommendations from the government, expanded the planning period 1 year to meet up with the national planning period, and did their tagging and prioritization, and came up with the final costing. This is what the Philippines' cost estimates look like. This is actually in U.S. dollars by year 2015 to 2028. They expanded the range of the NBSAP to cover these full dates, and they've used their themes that they came up with, as would be national targets or national strategies. And here it's urban biodiversity, forest terrestrial, protected areas, inland waterways, caves, cave systems, invasive alien species, and agro-biodiversity. You can see that there's quite a lot of spending in the first few years here. This is mostly tied to protected areas. That then, as you can see, drops down to about half. So there's initial capital investment to solve issues of conflict and infringement in protected areas, and then once that's settled, you drop down, and then you're increasing over time. Step 6, this is probably the most problematic part of the financial needs assessment in the current methodology. The idea is to compare the results of the projected expenditures as calculated in the Biodiversity Expenditure Review with the financial needs assessment. And the first part of this is you need to check the validity of that comparison. What were the assumptions and approaches used? Tagging of the expenditures in the Biodiversity Expenditure Review is essential, making sure that they and the FNA are tagged at the same level of detail is critical for this. And so then you basically compare the costing statements with the projected expenditures and analyze the gap by national strategy, by biofin categories, organization, things like that. This is an example of Philippines, again, biodiversity gap. This is a mapping of that graph I showed you just previously, where the costs rise quite high in the beginning, then they drop down and then rise more gradually, compared to 4 different expected financial scenarios based on their BER. Obviously, scenario 4 is more optimistic. Scenario 1 is the least optimistic, and this shows the difference between the financial needs and the expected available financing as the financing gap. Another example here is from Ecuador that looked at different results. Here's result 9, result 13, 3, and looked at a basic scenario and an optimal scenario for expenditures, and then looked at what the expected financing was on a percentage basis, which are the blue lines here, and then the gap. So basic gap scenario and optimal. So here you can see that the gap varies according to the different results, different activities that have been costed, and to do just a blanket gap analysis that shows we need X amount of money may be less useful for decision makers and for implementing the NBSAP as a very detailed results-based estimate to see that, for example, R15, the gap is enormous compared to the available funding, whereas others, this here, R13 indicates that there's a slight surplus under the basic scenario. Now, if you look at the optimal scenario, which is increased activity, then you can see there's a gap for almost all the results except for this one. Now, is there really a surplus in financing for this result? Probably not. It's probably because the biodiversity expenditure review and the financial needs assessment measure different things. And so that's something that needs to be looked at, and in many cases what we may want to focus on is what the financing needs are specifically, and are there existing finance sources able to support that finance need? If not, how are we going to finance that activity? If it's a priority, what are the finance tools available? Comparing it to the expenditure review is an interesting exercise, but it has not been hugely successful in many countries. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, finally, we're going to end and we'll get to the questions here. The conclusions, recommendations, and awareness. This is the endpoint. You want to develop clear conclusions and recommendations. You want to bring stakeholders along the whole way so that you're encouraging them to validate and institutionalize the recommendations, and then incorporate the FNA outputs into annual medium-term fiscal frameworks, national, local budgets, and planning activities. You'll have prioritized results and actions, and then you'll prepare a full report. Ideally, here's an outline. There's a much more detailed outline that's available in the chapter, as I mentioned before, and you can find the chapter at biodiversityfinance.net. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to pass it back to Anno, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, David. That was really an excellent presentation, and it's always a challenge to explain the whole methodology in short time. This was really good. So now we reached